Hi, and welcome to the 7th episode of the State of the Net podcast. I'm Paolo Vallemarin.
And I'm Ewan Simple.
And the sponsor this week is Squarespace. I just wanted... You said you were never going to have a sponsor, right?
Yeah.
Too bad. All right. We don't have a sponsor. Even Squarespace. They sponsor everybody, but
it's funny, isn't it?
us.
Because the same culprits are on almost all the podcasts. It's quite funny. I don't quite know how all that works, but
yeah, well, we actually do use Squarespace. It's a pretty good product. I mean, I admire the fact that they were able to do what I tried to do 20 years ago and failed to do.
Yes.
But
we also distinguish ourselves from other podcasts by not having Merlin Mann on the podcast, which puts us in a very small minority as well.
Yeah. Well, we are a niche podcast, and you must be a niche audience if you're listening to this. So the news this week is that you finally got a gig driving.
Yes. Not a proper truck, though, sadly. The company I was working for had somebody go sick, so it was a very big van, which was nonetheless challenging to get around some of the small villages that I was being sent off to deliver stuff in. And yeah, just as I posted a blog post about it this morning, just the whole thing of how new everything is. What am I meant to do? How am I meant to respond to different events throughout the day? And just trying to keep in your head all the legalities around driving time and distances and hours that you've worked. And there's quite a lot to take in on the first time, but that wasn't helped by the fact that I got pretty much stuck on the M25 for 3 hours, which is clearly going to be a key part of the experience. But yeah, it was. I've taken the first steps, as it were.
Well, congratulations. We all admire this effort. So you were telling me that you got an interesting link to an article this week.
Yeah, and very much in keeping with the topics that we tend to cover in the podcast, that a friend of mine, Thomas Power, shared a link to a Gartner report on the importance of what they're calling digital ethics, which Siri mistranslated as digital Essex, which is probably a whole different topic. But I thought it was interesting that, when the big companies like that start to use phrases like digital ethics, it's almost a sign that they're becoming less useful than they used to be. But it's also significant, I think, that they've taken it as a big enough challenge to raise the flag on it, as it were. And, it's really basically just, as I say, the things we talk about, the ethical challenges around the use of technology and who gets to decide what we do about them. So it's no bad thing that it's becoming a mainstream topic.
Oh, I'm sure that it will come more and more mainstream. It's as more and more decision will be centralized by and managed by algorithms, somebody will need to decide what the algorithm think about us.
I know. Well, and just the way you said that about being centralized, the other topic we were touching on before we started was politics, wasn't it? And the way power can frighteningly centralize and coalesce around individuals, never mind groups. Yeah,
well, this morning I was listening to the news, and this is the day they announced the victory of Bolsonaro as president of Brazil. And I have a colleague in Brazil. We were discussing about this election, and I was thinking she was probably not going to be happy about these results. And I was thinking, just like, lots of friends were not happy about Brexit, about Trump, about elections. And so this kind of got me down the how come that more and more situations like these are happening? How come that, and even the news over the weekend, the attack to the synagogue in America and the bombs sent to Obama and Clinton. How come this, I'm calling them fascist is a bit of a simplification, but just to use a label, how come all these fascist events and people and leaders are emerging now? And where were they until a few years ago? Because I think that most people would be attracted by these kind of ideas. It's probably something that comes very close to to the heart of many. And
most people.
okay, not most people, but I think it's much more common than we would expect. Especially.
Well, I think it certainly appeals to our baser instinct.
Exactly.
That's
I mean, there was a very interesting podcast I heard a while back to the. I'll put a link in the description to the son of some very important member of the Ku Klux Klan who grew up in that family and then went to university and changed his mind. And
yes, I think I heard that.
and he was he published a book recently, and he was telling the story of how when he, before his, let's call it, conversion, was working in Florida, I think, to trying to get votes, he would go and meet people and present these ideas without telling them where the ideas were coming from, and most people would actually relate to those ideas. So if somebody would tell them this is the Ku Klux Klan, they would say, "Oh, I don't even want to hear." But they would just listen to the ideas where you say, you need to care. It's very basic. You want to care about your family. You want to care about people like you. You want to care about. I mean, I can see how you can get traction with these kind of ideas. It's not the majority, but it's probably a sizable amount of people. Yet, until very recently, there were no candidates. I mean, from the end of the war, where we had plenty of experience with actual proper fascism, until just probably 10 years ago, there was no. It was much harder to find these kind of ideas. They tended to be in a niche somewhere, but they were struggling to go mainstream. And so I was thinking, is this because the gatekeeper to the public discourse was the press, and like it or not, coming from, I mean, they had their own set of ethical ideas, and they were sort of deciding who had access to the public opinion. The moment we start replacing that with the platforms that essentially do not have any type of that, nobody running social media platform want to be a gatekeeper. They actually try hard not to be. And suddenly there is no ethics attached to anything. And look, I don't want. Look, I'm not drawing this conclusion. This is just pretty much me thinking in the shower. But you kind of connect one thing to the other. I'm thinking, yes, of course, this is not the primary cause of it. But at the same time, I was wondering how much of this is, if you want, even the just a plain failure of the press or a plain failure of whatever is helping our society to keep it together.
So it comes no surprise to you that I have problems with that. In as much as it's a bit like religion. We wouldn't know what good was if religions didn't tell us, and that's nonsense. We do know. We understand when we cause pain and distress and the consequences of it for ourselves and others, and we don't need other people to tell us that. And likewise, I'm very wary when I hear people saying, "Oh, wasn't it easier in the old days when the news told us the truth?" Which I suppose is in a way what you're sort of saying, that without the news or the media or the press telling us a truth that steers us away from our baser instincts, then...
No, I wasn't implying that. I was more saying, as a gatekeeper, they would just not allowing certain voices to reach you. So it was basically, it was not a thing. If you had some kind of extremist ideas, you probably would not easily have access. You would not be.
But
heard.
it still begs the question of why people aren't able to make or are choosing to make a different decision about those people themselves. Just because the press aren't holding them back doesn't mean you suddenly start signing up to their views. And of course, as we said before we started the podcast, this is a whole bunch of different factors all happening at the same time. And even without the internet or the demise of the press's influence, arguably the liberal elite, whatever that means, who were trying to maintain that perspective on the world, left large swathes of the population behind them. And it's those large swathes that are becoming attracted to a voice that appears to represent them. But I think, you know, and you hear this even when you hear sometimes Trump supporters being interviewed, or that they're not stupid, you know, and they don't necessarily, you know, there's obviously minorities that we see on the telly that are clearly stupid, but most people who have voted perhaps for Trump or for breakfast are not stupid, and they saw the fallacies in both sides, but made a choice that met their needs. And, you know, I think in the short term that may give people like Trump and the chap in Brazil leverage, but not for long. And of course, again, this is the funny thing about the internet, isn't it? Because in some ways, okay, maybe it took some of the constraints away, maybe it allowed us to find people who shared our views and amplified those views faster, which allowed people to gain traction faster, blah, blah, blah. But that should also pertain to people thinking, hang on a minute, this isn't right, this isn't working, maybe we should pull back, maybe this isn't such a good idea. So I find it really interesting whether we will just find ourselves tramlining down a set of nightmarish decisions that ends up in a situation like the Second World War. But maybe I'm just too naive. I don't think so.
I mean, something that, for example, happened again this week was that in the aftermath of, I think, the attack on the synagogue in the US, there was one social network which was, I think that PayPal and GoDaddy and a whole bunch of major providers just stopped providing services to the social network, which essentially disappeared. Mm-hmm. Because this is where a lot on the anti-Semite conversation was happening. And so, I mean, apparently this guy who went and shot people was an active member in this group.
Right.
So again, of course, we cannot blame. I mean, it just happened. It doesn't make any sense to blame the internet, and I'm not even sure we should blame any platform. It's, you know, responsible people who happen to have that conversation in a place. But is enabling that conversation, does enabling those conversations bear any responsibility? Because you know, because if we go for the everybody is essentially an intelligent and good human being, regardless of politics or gods, then, you know, that should not be a problem. We should let everybody do anything. And you know, I know that the anarchist in you like this idea.
It's as much though an optimist in the sense that in the face of all the evidence, you know, I was just thinking about Israel and the way the Jews treat the Palestinians, and you would have thought after what happened in the Second World War they might have behaved differently. You know, it's just gobsmacking the way humans seem able to replicate appalling behaviour over and over again. So, but I do think
at this point we also need to piss off the Arabs, so that they probably.
I was going to say, as I said that, I thought, I'm probably, yeah, well, I can't imagine it.
Maybe can I suggest some censorship? On this?
Well, but actually, it's interesting because I've just finished reading an amazing book by an American psychologist who's now in her late 80s, who survived Auschwitz, and an amazing lady and an amazing ability to forgive, basically, and to go back and realise that she was carrying around, and many people carry around, all these memories and blame and aggression and anger and whatever else, but the only person who's paying any price is them. And I think that's part of what we're talking about here, that we have tended to have philosophies or religions or whatever that have externalized issues or solutions. You know, God's out there, he'll sort it for me. My boss is out there, he'll sort it for me. And of course, that's what's meant that we haven't learned to manage ourselves well. And I still remain optimistic that if we put more focus on that rather than giving up responsibility, then there's more chance of this complex organism working. And I mean, I did a post about this again since the last podcast where I was saying, that nature seems to manage incredible complexity and effectiveness and resilience on the basis of each individual animal or cell or part of the network, basically knowing what it's meant to be doing and doing it in consort with others. We could do the same.
Well, I guess that nature also gets rid of a very large amount. I mean, there is much more forms of life have been extinct in history of the universe than there are still around. If somebody doesn't work, it just kills down, which is probably what it's doing with us anyway.
Well, I mean, so I'm going to touch lots of buttons on this podcast, but I mean, that to me also seems like a fallacy that we think we're different and should be different.
Oh no, absolutely. That's I'm saying, as players of nature, basically, they might have just pulled the plug on us. I mean, nature will survive. Nature will exist even after, global warming and maybe the end of humankind.
And it is really interesting what it is about us as a species that makes us unable, unwilling to operate on that basis. We keep meddling. I mean, that was the point of the post. Instead of allowing a complex system to emerge and operate quite effectively, we feel that we need to be in control. And this is true in teams and management and business, countries. It's that getting in the way of the thing operating, which can have, can be difficult. I mean, yes, people suffer, but then they suffer and die anyway, and sometimes in mass numbers by our current means of trying to solve things. And it's just again that feeling that the internet was about originally about enabling the cells in a network. And I still think that's the prospect that it still holds out, and we're not even near allowing it to happen yet.
But so I finished reading recently the last Yuval Noah Harari book.
I haven't read it yet. Is it good?
Well, it's the third book.
I was going to say it's the third book written in a hurry.
Yeah, if you have read the first two, it is again. This one is titled 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, and it still reiterates some of the things. It does have some very interesting new ideas. But of course, one of the main themes that is present in this book was what sets us apart as a species is the fact that we tell stories, and we believe in the stories that we tell.
Yep.
And just to make an example, if you haven't read the book, the idea is that you can, in order to collaborate with other members of your species, you need to trust them. And you can only know a very limited amount of individuals. Mm-hmm. So how do you trust somebody you don't know? You can trust somebody you don't know if you both believe in the same story. Mm-hmm. So, for example, religion is a story. If we both believe in the same gods, we can trust each other because we have similar ethics. Yep. Another example, probably the most successful story of all, is money. You can pretty much go to anybody on the planet and hand them a wad of cash, especially if they're dollars, they will understand perfectly what you mean. And of course, the value of that money is based on the fact that we both believe in the story that those pieces of paper have some value. There is no inherent value in the piece of paper. So as you were saying, what sets us apart? Well, Noah Harari answer is stories. We can tell stories. We can invent stories, and most of all, we can believe in stories. Now, maybe what is interesting to think about is how the stories we tell and how the way we distribute the stories through the internet has changed the dynamics of how we interact, and possibly how our relationship work. And interesting enough, he present three big problems for the future. The three big problems in his idea is nuclear weapons, of which there are still too many around, and nobody is really doing very much to manage them. AI, nobody is really figuring out what to do with the future of how to manage the future of the ethics related to AI, and global warming, saying that we need to tackle this, otherwise it's going to be a serious problem. And he's saying why we're not thinking about these two problems enough.
So he gives us a reason. He's asking why rather than telling why.
Well, he has some arguments, and he's describing something around it. But essentially, at least my reading of it was that the main problem is that we're focusing on all too many things. And what these three problems, I mean, something that I remember is that what these three problems have in common is that they're all global problems. They're all problems that can only be solved if with a very, very large effort. It's not something where, while there is but also in previous book, he actually has this idea of how nationalism actually has been a force for good in many situations. And, it is true. It actually formed many of the modern institutions.
Italy, Germany, yep.
But at the same time, nationalism now is becoming is a tendency again. There is this idea of there was some interesting comments about this and how it is sexy in a way because it makes people feel good, but it is pulling us in the wrong direction, because in order to solve these big problems, the only way is to collaborate on a global level.
So that's interesting, because I met a friend who's connected with some Swedish philanthropist who's trying to suggest new global frameworks, decision-making bodies to try and address that problem. And again, it's interesting, and just listening back again to you talk about the stories and things, and, as an individual, and, with both of us getting interested in meditation and mindfulness, part of that is becoming more aware of the stories that we're constantly telling ourselves, never mind the ones that get out of our own heads, and how unhappy we can make ourselves with those stories, and how they make us behave sometimes dysfunctionally or unproductively with other people. And as you were describing the stories, I was thinking, well, we will probably never not tell stories, and in some ways, there's a risk of things becoming meaningless without stories. But it's almost like we just shouldn't take the stories too seriously, and it's when we start to take them seriously to the point of fighting to the death over my story's better than yours that we get in trouble. And if we just understood that it's a sort of working hypothesis, and the only reason we have the stories is so we can rub shoulders together, but if your story is different from mine, then here we can have a chat about it. And, it's because we need more practice. And even just the distancing, even just the practice of meditation, allowing you to distance yourself from that constant rumination that's going on in your head. We could almost do with that globally, just everybody stepping back from these very destructive stories that we're seduced by. And I think you're right. I mean, that's part of why the right is successful, because here's a strong character telling you that they'll look after you and this is the truth, and just it means you can sort of go, okay then, and it all sorts itself out, which of course is not true. But that's the attraction of it. And of course they manipulate the storytelling and they use the techniques. So it's interesting, because again, when you were talking about the internet, whether it's different or not, and I was thinking about memes, and the way we all used to talk about memes in the early days, and this sort of almost a biological viral metaphor for the way stories propagate around the internet. And I have varying degrees of comfort and discomfort with people trying to get good at that. Like I heard again about somebody the other day who was working on a word of mouth campaign. And it just always feels manipulative as soon as people start talking about that.
I actually think that Noah Harari, while promoting the book, he wrote an article essentially saying we have been doing fake news in all history of humankind. I mean, it's they have always been fake news.
It's not new.
You know,
Yep.
so I think that probably rather than being so upset about the new fake news, being mindful that everything is a story,
Yes.
and that
Yes.
sometime the story might be more related to the truth than other times, but in any case it will only be a story. No story can ever be the full truth.
Well, and isn't this the strength of the scientific method as opposed to religions? Because religions will try to maintain that their story is the truth, is the one story, is the only true story. Whereas science will think, well, this is a currently productive and working hypothesis, but will not take it too seriously because something new might come along, and then we'll just adapt the story to make more sense.
Even stepping one step farther away from it. I mean, I'm perfectly fine with the fact that we both believe in the story of money, as long as we both know that it is a story.
Yes.
It's I think that probably we're not aware enough that so many of these things are stories.
Yes.
And if we were more mindful, and by the way, Noah Harari is a big believer in mindfulness.
Yep.
Yes,
Yep.
and he meditates 2 hours a day,
and for months at a time on retreats. Yeah.
Yeah. So, part of this could be we all need to be. How do we all get more mindful? How do we get more people to start appreciating that what they see is not the whole truth? What they see
Yes.
is just a facet, it's just a story. I mean, from that point of view, I guess, and not that I've been doing anything different than thinking out loud all along today. Maybe showing you what is going on behind the curtain is interesting. I mean, what Facebook is doing with with political advertising, for example, showing you who is running that campaign and what other ads they have been running, is the kind of transparency that basically is breaking that fourth wall, and you're saying, hold on a second, this is a story. This is
totally
not the truth.
So that seems to get. I was thinking about writing another post about in the social network we put in inside the BBC. There was always people wanting to sell us tools or measurement tools or reporting tools, and my stance was always, if the tools help the whole network to see what's going on and what cause and effect is, then I'm all for it. If it's for a small group of people to get to watch the rest of us and then make decisions about us, you're not getting anywhere near it. And it's the same sort of principle, isn't it? That if transparency is a buzzword, and you can it creates challenges. It's not a trivial thing to try and aspire to. But I do think that if you make the cells in the network aware of the operation of the network and what the consequences of their actions are, then it at least gives them a secure basis on which to make a decision. It's back again to my chapter in the book called "We've All Got a Volume Control and Mob Rule." We need to be given the means and the tools to make better informed decisions as we take actions, as we open our mouths and say things. And I think you're right. I think a more common acknowledgement of the way, and this is all that Buddha did 2,500 years ago, was worked out the fact that we make ourselves unhappy by making up stories and then clinging to them and fighting over them and pretending that they're actual reality. Being more aware of that would be a good start.
And I think that on this note, we can start wrapping up today's episode, which was strangely political, but
I think we pressed lots of very ill-advised buttons on this one. Yeah,
I think we managed to piss off pretty much every group out there that could be offended by our thoughts.
Well, you're sort of assuming that the numbers of people who listen to this can aspire to be in groups, Paolo.
Yeah, well,
both of them hardly qualify as a group.
It might be what will get us viral.
This is true.
Anyway, thank you very much, everyone, for listening, and thank you for leaving your comments, giving us feedback, liking the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode or any other episode, please do recommend it to your friends.
See you next time.
Thank you.